Welcome to the Center for Climate and Security's Climate and Security podcast. I am your host, Dr. Sweta Chakraborty. Regular listeners will know that twice a month, we aim to bring you exclusive dialogues with the world's leading thinkers, educators, civil servants, and military personnel who work at the nexus of climate and security. I ask these experts to share with us their views and perspectives on how we can collectively prepare at this time of high consequence risk, particularly that of climate change. Today's podcast guest is Dr. Marcus King. Dr. King is a senior fellow and a distinguished member at the Center for Climate and Security. He is also an associate professor and director of the Master of Arts in International Affairs, the largest graduate degree program of its kind. Prior to this, he worked in the Pentagon as a foreign affairs specialist for the Deputy Undersecretary of Environmental Security, as well as an analyst on climate change security, resilience, adaptation, and energy security at the CNA. We'll get into all of that. His research and forthcoming book examines linkages between water scarcity and violent extremism. Marcus, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here.
So let's get right into this. Let's talk a little bit about the linkages that you're exploring in your book. Tell me a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So my area of teaching and research is called environmental security. And so the way that I define that is conflicts related to lack or abundance of natural resources. And so what I've been looking at most recently is the impacts of climate change. And I found that droughts, water scarcity are actually one of the more visceral, one of the more salient impacts of climate change. And so I've been sort of on that, let's say, tangent for a while. And so what I've been looking at is the idea of environmental scarcity and how it relates to conflict in various areas. And that's really led me toward the Middle East and North Africa. So I could tell you a little bit more about the findings of my research. In order to look at the connections between conflict and environmental degradation, we've come up with something called the paths of influence. So it's a long way from the physical impact of climate change, like a persistent drought, to the eventual outcome, which may or may not be conflict. And what we do is we look at first the physical impacts, then the ecological impacts of the whole ecosystem, and then how that relates to human systems and human reactions. So to give you an example, I've been doing 3 case studies. The first was Syria and Iraq, but the second has been 3 separate conflicts in Nigeria that all relate to water or scarcity in one way or another. And so probably the most surprising of these conflicts has been in the area called the Middle Belt of Nigeria, which is right below the Sahel. So it's this area of transition between the desert and basically the more temperate forests in the south. What we've seen in the Sahel is there's been recurring drought. There's been disputes between the pastoralists and the herders. The pastoralists are those, the pastoralists who are farmers who are growing the crops, and then the herders who are coming down from the north and encroaching on those crops. And so what we found is that there's been disruptions in the normal patterns of life there.
What was it like exactly? What's changed? So this addition, you see this interaction that wasn't traditionally the case, but what's causing it? What was it like before and what is it like now?
So the impact of climate change has made the fertile areas a lot more scarce within the Middle Belt, and so this has led to conflicts, as I said, between the farmers and the herders, has caused some of the farmers to have to relocate, so it's increased urbanization, for example, in Nigeria, and it's also led to desertification and general scarcity that's created conflict between these 2 groups. But it's important to remember that there are underlying tensions and other reasons for this conflict. So there's existing religious cleavages, there's existing tribal differences, and so all this has been aggravated by the sudden onset of climate change-related drought in the region.
Sure. So it's safe to say that there's an entire spectrum of issues that are resulting in some of these outcomes that you're researching, and climate change is playing a significant role. It's one of the many. What do you say to those who are skeptical of really the impact that environmental changes has? How confident and sure are you that that really is a significant portion of all of the different reasons behind why we're seeing the conflict we see today?
Well, because those questions are very valid, we have to look at particular case studies. So I avoid, sweeping generalizations, but I've looked at conflict within states, generally in drought-afflicted areas. So that is a sample size that's already relevant to environmental change. But within those contexts, I would say that climate change has, in different categories, acted as a catalyst. So there were these underlying divisions, there were these underlying differences between groups, but in an atmosphere of greater scarcity, driven by environmental causes, we've seen increasing conflict. And so to the doubters, we just ask them to take a closer look at the specific instances that are taking place within states, within countries that are drought afflicted. And so we start with those to begin with.
And there's a little bit of common sense here too. I mean, if your livelihood has been around agriculture and then all of a sudden water is becoming increasingly scarce, what do? If you just sort of put yourself in that situation, you can imagine that there's going to be changes and there's going to be outcomes of those resulting behavior changes. And so it's interesting to see that you're tracking that sort of change and you're using the case study of Africa. Can you give a few more examples? Where is water scarcity really making an impact and the case you make resulting in conflict in other parts of the world?
So I've centered my analysis on the Middle East and North Africa, but there's a few different examples. There's the case of Syria, which has probably been talked about by other people in this series. But the idea is, I said the catalyst is climate change or droughts, but also if there's sort of a vector of change, that's really migration. So what we saw in the events leading up to the Syrian civil war, for example, was the worst drought in instrumental record in 2011. This led to a spike in food prices of wheat on the global market, and we saw people were dislocated. They moved from the more agricultural to the more urban centers within Syria. Within Syria, the government was unable to provide them with municipal services. People were alienated. There were these existing underlying changes. The underlying differences between the ruling Alawite majority and the Sunni minority. And that led, among many other things, was a catalyst of the civil war there in Syria. So Syria is another example. And I have a few others. I see things coming together in Yemen in a serious way that's led to a humanitarian catastrophe in that region due to lack of potable water, lack of sanitation, and again, problems driven by environmental degradation and drought.
Are there examples of water scarcity not resulting in conflict? How do other nations and other regions deal with the same sort of conditions that resulted in these migrations that then led to conflict? The examples you gave that clearly illustrate that. Are there counterexamples? And how do we explain that?
So the dominant literature within security studies and also within water and development has found that over the last 2,500 years, since Mesopotamia, water scarcity has overwhelmingly led to cooperation between nations as opposed to conflict. So there are a few things to think about there. I said between nations. So nations that tend to share river basins, water courses, find it necessary on the international stage under international rules and laws to cooperate, and that's been happening, as I said, for several millennia. But what we're seeing now is there's more instability within states. So I'm looking at things like groundwater, not necessarily shared river systems, and I'm looking at states that already have these existing cleavages or instability, and then seeing how water plays into this instability. So it's different. The cooperation's really been on the international level, and a lot of the conflict's really been within states. And then also things are just changing. I mean, there's been more of an atmosphere of water scarcity globally over the next, and by 2050, the 1.8 billion people will be suffering from water scarcity. And so the absolute scarcity has been another factor. I think that will in the future maybe even lead to conflicts at the interstate level, where states are using...
which we haven't traditionally seen as of yet, but given the increasing population and the diminishing access to water and availability of water, you predict that might be the case.
So there was an intelligence community assessment in 2012 put out by the intelligence community as a whole, which looked at global water scarcity. So in 2012, it said within the next 10 years, they would expect to see disputes between states where at least one state might use water sources as leverage over another, as political leverage. And so we're beginning, I think, to see this, we're not quite 10 years in, but I think there's situations, for example, like the upstream riparian of Ethiopia and the Nile Renaissance Dam and their relationship to Egypt, and some of those political dynamics are an example where some interstate rivalry is beginning to emerge.
Wow. So can you talk a little bit more about the ripple effects from the water scarcity then resulting in these migrations? What have we seen? I mean, it's headline news in terms of refugees and movements from those areas of conflict into states that are considered more opportunity and just a better quality of life, because these migrants are leaving areas that are uninhabitable in their opinion, and obviously from the rest of the world's view too. And so what does this mean in terms of what to expect as those who are potentially receiving a lot of these climate refugees, if that's how you would like to refer to them, if that's what you would want to refer to them as, not to put words in your mouth? Is that something we're going to see more of? What is the prediction there? How are the movements going to be?
Yeah, so first I just wanted to address this term climate refugee, if I might. And one problem is from sort of a juridical legal sense, there is no such thing as a climate refugee. And that's because under international law, refugees are afforded certain legal status, the status of asylum. And so given the magnitude of environmental migrants or people dislocated by environmental problems, I don't think the world is prepared yet to absorb that number of migrants. And so they don't have that status as refugees. And so that's an issue. It's something that something called the Nansen Initiative is responding to. Governments within the UN are thinking about ways to recast exactly what environmental migrants might be. But one story I can think of to illustrate what you were saying and the effects of environmental migration, it could be Lake Chad, which is another region, adjacent to Nigeria that I've been researching. One of the worst humanitarian crises is occurring now. And that has to do with desiccation of the lake itself, or shrinkage. And so the lake has shrunk 90% since 1960. And this has caused massive dislocation of those that relied on the lake for either farming or aquaculture. These people are displaced. There's been a famine. It's been hard for the international relief organizations to get in there due to the activities of Boko Haram to really assess the situation. Now that they have, they've discovered just how dire it is. But what I've noticed is that societies or groups of people that are dislocated for environmental reasons are less resilient to attacks by groups like Boko Haram, by groups like Al-Shabaab in Somalia. So there's that relationship of an already vulnerable population increasing their vulnerability related to these environmental causes.
So thank you for clarifying climate refugees. So environmental migrants, and they're moving out from the traditional areas that they have lived for generations. They're moving into increasingly urbanizing cities that are already populated, overpopulated in a lot of cases. What happens to this influx of migrants?
Yeah, so all the rural-urban migration that's been sparked by poverty and, in some cases environmentally induced, that I've studied has been in countries that are already suffering from what we might say is overpopulation. But it's not just overpopulation, it's the distribution of the population. So there are people in the 18 to 25-year-old category, for example, in Somalia, form the basis of a lot of the refugees. So it's people that have aspirations who can't find jobs. Frankly, it's military-aged males are among the refugees. And so when these people do immigrate to urban centers, they find themselves on the peripheries of these cities. They're not getting the municipal services that they would have been accustomed to in a lot of cases, but also they just don't have the opportunities for schools and generally for a better life. And so we found in some examples like Syria, for example, this leads to the potential for adherence to militant groups, radicalization of people, and for example, joining civil wars, sometimes because it's literally a way to further themselves economically, more so than their exact partisan position within the war. So that's really unfortunate there.
And this is also potentially due to no other options. It's not that they're volunteering for this. Why wouldn't they just choose another path and just go cross whatever body of water that they need to and find a better economic future?
Well, that's been a real challenge because, a lot of the migrants have come in, what's been called an arc of instability, where people have moved from Nigeria, for example, West Africa, up toward the Mediterranean, trying to get access to Southern Europe. So, that's been a very, salient security issue. And I think the European community has been trying to find more and more ways to limit migration, obviously, due to the the political atmosphere in a lot of the countries. And so I think what they've been doing is they've been trying to stop migrants within the countries and in centers before they're able to actually get on the boats and go across to Europe. And so I think the problem's growing in some of these relocation centers in places like Morocco, Tunisia, Libya.
Which is creating a bottleneck situation.
Yeah, it's a bottleneck situation, and they just don't have access to better opportunities that might be represented in Europe, for example.
So as a leading authority in this space, and what a fascinating cross-section of work you have to look at. I mean, there's so many elements here. What would you advise those who are in a position to be able to really create some measures to alleviate this across the entire spectrum, from those who are being uprooted to those who are forced to to travel and to try and see if they can do something to improve their condition and that of their families? What are the solutions to this, if there are any?
So a lot of the work that we do, especially at the Elliott School, is policy focused. So for academics, we're really focused on solutions. And so the community that I write to and think about usually is the U.S. foreign policy community. So there's solutions across what they call the 3Ds of diplomacy, of foreign affairs, defense, development, and diplomacy. And what I see is a lot of this obviously has to do with development and development policy. So the first thing that I would encourage is that people support the idea of foreign assistance. Foreign assistance budgets have been cut. So within foreign assistance, we have to think about targeting, sort of the modest aid that is available, but doing it in a way that would be climate sensitive. So thinking about climate adaptation, or what are the effects of environmental degradation in areas where our projects are being delivered. So it's targeted development assistance related to climate adaptation. It's understanding where the next famine is going to occur to try to preposition assets and food resources, working with the international community to take care of that. So a lot of it, I think, starts with the development approach, and when the development approach fails, then we're into the other Ds. We're into defense. We're into trying to incorporate provision of environmental resources into things like counterinsurgency strategies, so we can better understand what the motivations are of the people that we've found as our rivals in these areas. So the solutions from the perspective of the U.S. government have to come from all of the 3Ds: defense, development, and diplomacy. And then diplomacy is just trying to bring together parties at the table through something that might be called, hydrodiplomacy, science diplomacy, which is using the capacities resident in the U.S. government to provide data so people can understand exactly what the degradation is, what the amount of resources are, and use that knowledge as a basis to negotiate and to try to better redistribute those resources in their societies.
So I see the solutions that you've described very clearly from the security angle. What about from the climate angle? Is there something we can do to alleviate the situation at the ground where the problem is starting? I mean, is there some way to improve access to water, address water scarcity? Can't we just take the water from the oceans?
So the way that I look at the engagement of the defense community with climate change is I always put it into three buckets or three silos. The first is, opportunities for mitigation of climate change. The second would be adaptation. So that has to do with the effect of climate change on roles and missions of the military, for example, and also on facilities. But then there's this third bucket where I sort of have spent my time looking at, which is the idea of consequence management of failure to adapt to climate change. And so I think we need to focus on this idea of consequence management of the failure. And the reason I say that is mitigation's really not the answer now, because if we were to go back to sort of the Stone Age, zero carbon emissions, it still might take 30 to 50 years before that feedback, is really taken up by the Earth system, and we begin to see the reversal of climate change. So I don't know that there's anything we can do from a mitigation standpoint. Also, the socioeconomic models and the science models both only go out reliably maybe a decade or two. So within this time frame, we really have to look at consequence management. And it's not that mitigation is something we shouldn't focus on, but it's at this point where we really have to deal with consequence management, and our predictive capabilities are really within that time frame.
Okay, so that sounds loud and clear. So we really need to adapt to the new conditions and be prepared for what we know 10, 20 years out for sure to expect in that regard. What about some solutions like desalination of ocean water? Are there ways to improve our access to potable water?
Yeah, so in terms of that, one of our main audiences are policymakers, but also to find these solutions to provide more water, it's really important to involve industry and the private sector, because something like desalination on a large scale, it takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of investment, and to have to build energy plants, to mobilize that sort of capital that's needed to invest, you need political stability. So you have to first take care of the politics, and then bring in the private sector, with their entrepreneurial capacity to improve on desalination, to build the power plants necessary. Hopefully you have siting where the need for the water is actually somewhat close to the ocean, for example. So you have to have the advantage of siting, but it's mobilizing the capital and giving people confidence that the political stability of an area can be maintained in a way that it will attract investment. So the private sector is extremely important in this puzzle.
Sounds like it. So it really goes full circle, doesn't it? We need stability on the ground to be able to come up with some of these viable solutions to address the scarcity issue. And so you have students, you teach your students, and where's the opportunity here that you see for them in terms of the spectrum of the challenges that we're facing with climate change, but really the impact on water? I mean, where's the science, where's the technology, where are the engineering solutions that you would encourage them to pursue? And in addition to that, in addition to the work that academia is doing towards in policy and addressing and improving governance at those highest levels for these innovations to really take hold and result in benefit for the communities that need them the most, where else do you see real opportunity for the future to really take advantage in some way, the silver lining here?
Well, as an educator, I'm focused on the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington, and what we do there is we really train policymakers. So I have to focus more on the governance piece. So within our coursework on environmental security, we have sort of two groups there. We've got people that might have come in from other parts of the university who are urban planners or perhaps environmental engineers who will take that one class in national security, and they'll understand how national security can be inculcated into some of their work. And then we've got the larger percentage of students in my school which are going to join the State Department. They're going to be analysts, and really understanding that they need to mainstream climate change and environmental degradation into the work that they'll already be doing. So these are the future Foreign Service officers, the future analysts at the intelligence agencies. So it's, understanding technical solutions enough to be able to brief these sorts of solutions to their superiors, to be able to understand them from a policy standpoint. but we really don't train people to understand and implement the technical solutions.
But there's that collaboration that's encouraged, because there will be a need to break down any sort of silos. To address a problem this complex will require skill sets across so many different areas of expertise. And what you're doing and the training that you're providing, the ones who are going to really be faced with this problem head on and have to solve it and address it in ways that we're setting them up for now, is very commendable. So thank you for being that educator, along with, and all the research that you're doing and providing, and along with your colleagues, really bringing this to the forefront of education for those who are going to need to be armed with this information. So that's excellent to hear. What would you tell listeners that they could do? It sounds like these issues are massive. They seem so overwhelming, and what the average person in America who might be inconvenienced by turning on their faucet and not getting the same pressure of water that they're used to in however many years that becomes a reality for us, when they hear about these challenges, is that something that we here in this country can anticipate could potentially reach us? And how quickly is that going to be? And what can we do as consumers of water to offset that future?
So there's a big difference in thinking in the United States between the East Coast, the Midwest, and the West Coast. So water scarcity is sort of nothing new to California and the Southwest. And so they're experiencing it, even this summer related to wildfires, for example, the drought out there. The degradation in the ability to grow crops in America's breadbasket in the Central Valley in California. People in California are really beginning to feel the effects of water rationing, for example. So I think it varies across the United States how much people are aware of it. But in places like California, I think they're looking to other countries like Israel. That's been an innovator in things like more advanced irrigation technology to see if they can implement some of those solutions, looking at better governance structures, eliminating the number of municipal water districts, because now there are hundreds of them, in trying to centralize authority and governance over water issues. So there's a lot more awareness, I think, on the West Coast than on the East Coast. But these issues are becoming more and more important across the country.
Sure. And thank you for bringing it to the awareness of those who are listening, and through all the work that you're doing. And your book is coming out soon. We'll look forward to seeing that. And Marcus, thank you so much for taking the time and joining me here today. Really appreciate you being here.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Climate and Security Podcast. We'd love to hear from you. Please tweet me directly at SWETAC or the Center for Climate and Security's Twitter handle. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe, write a review on iTunes, share widely, and finally, consider donating to the podcast from the Center of Climate and Security's podcast page, www.climateinsecurity.org/podcast, by clicking on Make a Donation. We will continue the series of conversations with the most prolific and dedicated folks in this space, and your support is greatly appreciated. Thank you, and please tune in again for the next episode of the Climate and Security Podcast.